I think my village was haunted by God. Part 1. A story by user Harold Keeber. I hope this is the right place and someone can tell me what may have been going on in my village. I moved here a few weeks ago. It's a small village in the heart of Russia, and my parents and I came here because things start to get really bad in Moscow, and my father lost his job. I don't know why we had to move to this isolated village so far away from civilization. Maybe my parents wanted peace and quiet? To escape the things in that city, the poison mines? The houses here had all been far below average in price. Almost everyone who lives here has moved here recently. But there are crazy rumors about this village that people tell each other. It was found abandoned in the mid-90s. Where everyone went, no one knows. They say that no signs of people were found at all, nothing. But everywhere in and around the village, strange patches of earth had been discovered, circular and smooth. Not only in the forest or on the road, but also in the dilapidated wooden houses. At our new neighbor's house, one of the mysterious spots had supposedly been found right in the living room floor, where the floorboards had been just cut away. These rumors scare me. I am afraid of this village. But yesterday, I was redoing the floor in my room with my father, and there, I found a notebook under the old boards. I hid it from my father, I don't know why. Someone must have left it there. Last night, that's when I read it. I read it, and now I'm incredibly afraid of this house and this village. Of the fields and the woods that surround me. The notebook apparently belonged to someone called Ilya Vasilev. I have tried to translate what he wrote, hoping that someone here can help me find an explanation for the rumors. For this uneasy feeling that I have since I moved here. I am fine. I want that to be clear from the beginning. My story is strange and in huge parts troubling, but I am still in the best state of mental health. I am fine. My story begins 7 months ago, in December 1979, when deep winter was upon our village. We were preparing for Christmas, the first Christmas to be celebrated publicly throughout the village, after years of having to practice our faith in secret because the Soviet government did not allow religions. Only in the last few years did the Reds' view loosen and they allowed small islands of faith. One of them was my village, which finally dared to celebrate and praise the Lord. I have been a believer all 20 years of my life, an exemplary Christian, just like my parents. Faith had kept our family line alive in times of terror and misery. Death had always been close to us. As the fields where most of the population of our village had worked for generations had once brought the end of hundreds of people. Many years ago, on those fields, atrocities had occurred that had finally given them their present name, the fields of death. I myself had not been born back then, not by a long shot, but my grandparents had spent their childhood there, a childhood full of hunger and depravity. My grandfather Fomenko often told me and my sister the stories he had experienced and how faith had saved everyone. There had been a long, cold winter and the grain had been confiscated by the government to be taken to the cities for distribution. After all, the grain belonged to all the people. Not just those on the farms who planted it, tended to it, and harvested it. And so, the only food of that time left my grandfather's village and never came back. Some of his neighbors had once tried to hold back some grain, to hide some sacks, but when they were caught, a hail of bullets determined their fate. People lived in fear, not daring to stop working, not daring to keep for themselves the food that was destined for the common good. In those days, horrors happened in my village that I cannot truly picture today, not even when I hear my grandfather's usually clear voice begin to tremble. When I see in his eyes that he would rather forget, in order to experience a peaceful sleep once again, someday. He told us about those horrors to warn us of how quickly life can plunge from safety into infinite terror. Winter had reigned. The grain was being hauled away. They still shot all those who tried to keep back pieces of it, be it a sack or some husks that had fallen from a cart. In time, hunger began to drive people in our village insane. Parents locked up their children so they wouldn't be taken by neighbors to feed their hunger. Friends turned their backs on each other and killed each other in fights for the last livestock that was still breathing. The streets reeked of decay and death, of misery and suffering. One day, my grandfather told us, he had hidden in the back room of his house while his parents dragged themselves, emaciated, to the fields to pick the last scraps of grain from the furrows with their dirty, half-frozen fingers. He had come across a book there, a book that had saved his life. The Word of God. An old Bible. My grandfather had learned to read at an early age, one of the sad advantages of living in the Soviet Union. It was in the room I now live in that Grandfather Fomenko had found the dusty book. Actually, he had been looking for something to eat, the days before he had found some sawdust. But despite his hunger and the grumbling in his stomach, eating the book was out of the question. Books were sacred, and no book as sacred as this one. He had begun to read and learned about the greatness of the Lord, of the miracles his Son had performed, and of the magic of faith. His stomach had growled, but he had ignored it. The words gave him comfort. The next day he immersed himself in the book again, disappearing into better worlds and times, hearing wisdom and encouragement. But around noon there was a knock at the door. My grandfather emphasized each time that he had not been afraid, that he had known that the Lord would protect him. When the old neighbor gained entrance to our house armed with a cleaver, it was clear what he wanted: meat. My grandfather told us each time about how the neighbor had looked more undead than human, stinking and with sunken eyes, smelling like death from his mouth, the cleaver trembling in his hand. "I'm sorry, boy," was all the man could get out. My grandfather tried to mimic this poor man's voice at the end of his wits, to express his pain through words so that we understood that poor fellow a little. The Lord's words had given courage to my grandfather in his most terrible moments. He had stood up and firmly said, "Away with you, the Lord protects the inhabitants of this house." But the intruder did not care, coming closer. And so, my grandfather again sought comfort and prayed. He prayed for mercy and peace and for his life. He would serve the Lord for the rest of his days. Trust him blindly. Suddenly, like a gruesome miracle, the famished intruder let out an inhuman groan and collapsed, lifeless and debilitated. There had been no hunger for my grandfather and his family for a week after that. My grandfather had been praying to the Lord since that day, thanking him for his mercy. The story spread around the village, and out of desperation or hope, in the next few days everyone secretly knelt in front of small wooden crosses they had made themselves and prayed to the Lord. A week later, like a miracle, the long-awaited delivery of grain arrived, along with spring. There had not been another bad time since then. These events are the reason for the faith in our village and our family. The psalm my grandfather had prayed as the hungry neighbor attacked had become the guiding psalm of our faith. All these years we had not been able to celebrate Christmas with the other families, but since the restrictions on faith communities had been relaxed, we had all finally decided to celebrate the holy festival in the village square. And so, we started the preparations. There, in those evening hours, my part of the story begins. I and my younger sister Zarina, together with other youths and young adults, were fetching wood for the fire that was to burn in the center of our village. So, we went out into the night, dressed with thick pelts, to fetch logs from the edge of the fields that some men had prepared. My breath could be seen as an icy breeze in the dawning darkness, and I was already looking forward to dancing around the fire with everyone later, drinking good drinks and eating sumptuously. I was glad that we didn't have to walk across the fields themselves, but could stroll along their edge to get the logs. You can feel death when it has hit a place. I was glad that I didn't have to work the fields myself and had learned the carpentry trade. Therefore, I was spared from having to wander around there every day, among the echoes of past atrocities and sadness. We were all in good spirits, strolling over the muddy ground, when all at once Zarina pointed up and into the clear night sky. "Look, an angel is descending," she exclaimed excitedly. We all looked to where her outstretched hand pointed. A round light glowed in the night sky, glaring yellowish and shining strangely cold. "It's singing! At Christmas! The Lord puts our feast under his sign!" Zarina cried. We stopped and listened into the silence of the night. At first, I could hear nothing. At first, everything remained quiet, and only the distant beating of axes and the rustling of the wind in the treetops were audible. But then, there in the wind, I could hear it, briefly but clearly. It was a kind of melodic whisper, joyful, yet also strange and otherworldly. It was heard only very briefly, and soon died away as the glow flew out of sight and disappeared somewhere far away. "Let's go find the angel. Let's," Zarina cried, continuing excitedly, but I interrupted her. We have to get the wood. We can report back to the village later, if it hasn't already been noticed there too, I said. You heard the singing. Surely that was an angel. Shall we leave it there? It may have gotten hurt, it must have hit something. Sasha murmured. Sasha was my oldest friend and one of the boys who worked on the fields. He had always been very caring and had always tried to help where he could. His parents were long dead and the old lady who had raised him was no longer around, either. So, he struggled along, working the fields, but the rest of us looked out for him. Shouldn't we go and look for it, Ilya? Sasha continued to urge me anxiously. We thought about it for a long time, but decided to leave the decision to the others in the village. Trusting the Lord to guide our actions, we quickly moved on in the direction of the woodcutters to complete our task. We were not the only ones who had seen the glow. When we returned to the village square loaded with logs, everyone was in great excitement and full of joy that the Lord had sent us this sign of His greatness. Not everyone agreed whether it was an angel or a return of the poinsettia that had been witnessed, but everyone was sure that the Lord had sent us encouragement. So, we celebrated our first Christmas full of joy and pleasure, with good food, dancing and singing, full of happiness and under the protection of the Almighty Lord. I will always think back to those days, always keep in my heart how I glimpsed a part of the Lord in the sky. We all talked about the event and even the older people were fascinated and inspired. Even my grandfather and the others who had witnessed the worst death and misery in the world seemed to slowly find a spiritual peace. They would never have dreamed of otherwise. They were happy and strengthened in their faith. However, we were not sure if it had really been an angel who had come down, and so we hesitated to go and look for the creature of God. But in the night, after the light had shone in the sky, I was awakened by Zarina crying in her sleep. I straightened up and slowly paced over to her bed, where in the semi-darkness she began to squirm, shaken by spasms. No, 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 she moaned painfully. I began to shake her to wake her up. Zarina did not respond to me. Her face was like a distorted mask hiding something bad underneath. Her breathing became shallow, and she began to whimper. I was terrified and began to pray. The Lord had to save her, He just had to save her. Zarina twitched more and more, started coughing and whimpering louder and louder. Slowly, the rest of the family woke up and my parents and grandfather huddled tightly around her, praying for her to open her eyes. Please, don't take our child. She has only been in your world for 14 years, my father cried, as panicked and desperate as I had ever seen before. His thick, black mustache trembled with fear. Then, abruptly, Zarina stopped convulsing. For a terrible moment she just lay there, her hair disheveled, her face pale in the glow of the candle my mother held over her. Mom, Dad, Ilya, Grandpa, what's wrong? She suddenly asked sleepily. For a moment it was as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just seen my sister almost die. But then she began to cry. What's wrong, dear? My father asked, just as pale in the face as Zarina. It took a while before she found some calm and was able to talk to us. Finally, she croaked. I saw the angel. I was with him. A revelation? Had the Lord touched my sister? We all said another prayer, and finally, filled with awe, I asked, where did you see the angel? Is it here? With us? She looked at me briefly, seemed to hesitate for a little moment, and then reported. I was with it, in a dream. It was in a white village, a village made of angel dust. I saw it. It didn't have wings, and that's why at first I wasn't sure if it was an angel. However, soon it spoke to me. What did it say, Zarina? I asked tensely. It said it was not God, but the witness. It sounded like a man and a woman and a child and a baby, and it felt peaceful, calm and carefree. Then I woke up. An angel. Angels are the witnesses of God, that's how it must be, my father said enthusiastically. Suddenly, everyone seemed to be talking at once. No one knew what Zarina's words meant, but we were sure that they contained something incomprehensible that we, as ordinary people, could not understand. But everyone was delighted. Everyone was caught in a beautiful dream. The next day, the adults sat together in the large barn near the edge of the village, which was used for community events. Most of them found seats on the lined-up wooden benches, and the rest stood crowded against the old walls, some of which were already rotten. Dimitri, probably the closest thing to a mayor, sat at a heavy pine table at the end of the room, staring at the crowd, while my parents and Zarina sat on old chairs in front of him. Tensely, the crowd looked at them, waiting for someone to say something. Finally, Dimitri cleared his throat thoughtfully. "You all saw or heard about the falling star. It was brighter than the others that keep crossing our sky, and much more melodic. Some even heard the singing. Whoever still doubted that the Lord sent us his messenger, doubts are now useless. Zarina has received a vision. She has seen how the angel, who was sent by God, walked on our earth, and visited a village and consecrated it with its grace. She has seen the angel marching to spread holiness in these lands." "Are we sure?" Mary, the dressmaker, had stood up. She was still young, my age and Sasha's, and she always wore her blonde hair carefully braided, her dresses self-made, blood red and flashy, with silver embroidery. As always, she wore makeup, a luxury not many could afford. In other places she would have been considered a lady, but she was also a skeptical person, and I had not liked her very much since childhood, because she often made insinuations that seemed to go against the Lord. Also, she had never played with us outside and had always thought of herself as someone better. I was shocked that she now so obviously doubted the Lord's actions. "Mary, Zarina has seen a vision. The Lord spoke to her through her dreams. An angel has joined us. How can you deny it?" my father asked coldly. "I'm not denying it, I'm just saying, what if there is something dark that the angel was sent to fight? What if it is going into battle against some unknown evil? The angel may be spreading sanctities, but we have no idea if it is trying to redeem us or defend us." "It said it was a witness of God," I noted. "That's what Zarina said when she woke up." "Then it is benevolent to us. We must find it," someone shouted from one of the back rows. An excited murmur began to spread through the room. "Silence!" Dimitri thundered. His face looked hard but determined. "We have to get to it. If it is a message from heaven that the angel wants to bring us, we must hear it. How many can we spare? Who would even want to voluntarily leave the village? We don't know how long the journey will be, and you yourselves know how dangerous this area can be." A loud commotion broke out. Everyone shouted at once and volunteered. I also jumped up and loudly offered to go out to look for it. The angel. The witness of the Lord. I imagined meeting it in a clearing, under a full moon, hearing its bright voice, gaze in awe at its graceful form, and fall to my knees in prayer before it. "Silence!" Dimitri shouted. "You can't all go. The kids wouldn't make it in the deadly cold out there. Let 7 go. 7 is the Lord's number, there must be 7. 7 workers from the fields. We can't spare any more." "You can't be serious," I cried out. Cold anger boiled up inside me. "I want to go, too. We all want to. You can't just stand there and make a decision like that." Others joined in. "Silence," Alexei now thundered, the master blacksmith. "We need you. Daniel, Ilya, Nikita, you have a job to do. We can't get by without you. You can't go, be reasonable. But if the Lord wills it, he will make sure that everything here will work out. That nothing will happen," I tried to argue, still boiling with anger. "No. Winter is tugging at our huts, we need you," my father said slowly. "So do the others. Without you, it's going to be tight. The fields lie under the snow, but everything else will be weakened by time and storms. We can only spare the field hands. Besides, they're the ones most likely to withstand the cold and the wilderness. After all, they're constantly out on the fields of death, toiling in the wind and rain. They'll all make the trip." I tried to change his mind, and several came to my aid, all those who were also forced to stay. "You can manage without a dressmaker. I want to go too," Mary cried defiantly, her cheeks red with anger, her nose wrinkled. This young woman really believed she deserved the sight of the angel. She really believed her hypocrisies would deceive the Lord, despite her obvious doubts about his divinity. Others also complained, young and old, many who didn't deserve to go and even those who did. But it didn't help. Dimitri was in charge. Everyone knew that. If we started to contradict him, our village would soon end up in chaos. And deep down I knew that I had to stay. That I had to take care of my sister, who would not survive a trip in the snow. That I had to repair the huts that the storms would eat away at. Sasha was a field worker, he was allowed to go. Sasha and Sophia, Anatoly and old Igor, Ivan and Yulia and Mikhail. When the decision was made, a decision many of us accepted only with heavy hearts and which brought out deep envy in several faces, some of the chosen ones began to cry. They were happy, fulfilled, satisfied. They would see the messenger of the Lord, hear its melodious voice, sing its hymns. Why wasn't I allowed to go? Why was the world so unfair? I had always believed in the Lord, prayed to Him, been subject to Him and lived according to His will. Why hadn't He chosen me to see His messenger? I had been so proud back when I had been allowed to learn the carpenter's trade and thus had not to go to the fields of death to toil there. At that time, I had felt like someone better when I saw Sasha and Sophia setting out early in the morning with all the other workers. With their old-fashioned clothes and thick, shabby clothes. Was this the punishment for my arrogance? The Lord knew everything. He had seen what repulsive thoughts I had had, how superior I had felt to the others. Perhaps it was my punishment that I was not allowed to go. Perhaps the Lord was no longer favorable to me and I would have to prove myself to Him. The next day, the 7 set out north. They were seen off with singing and dancing, they were the center of the village's attention. Envy threatened to drown me. Why not me? Why wasn't I allowed to go? Why did I have to stay here? And I knew, it was because of these thoughts. I wasn't pure enough. I had to get better, work on myself. As the others disappeared from sight, as the small group seemed to be swallowed up by a patch of forest between distant trees, an icy chill ran down my spine. What if they really did encounter evil? What if Mary had been right? I pray to the Lord that they would return home safely. Even the darkness will not be dark to you, the night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. He would bring them home safely, our pilgrims. I did not begrudge them their happiness. I was not a selfish person, was not complacent like Mary or some others in the village. I lived by the word of the Lord and I would not begrudge them. They would all return home safely. I continued to stare into the distance for a long time as my suppressed envy sought to consume me. But I was winning. For darkness is as light to you. Even though the days and weeks passed, I never forgot to think of all those who had set out to witness the glory of the Lord. The cold winter had passed and frost and cold left the land, so that soon we could begin to prepare the fields for sowing. Since the sighting of the angel had caused us to let some of the farm workers leave, and they stayed away longer than we had expected. I had to join others in helping to plow the fields of death. The work was exhausting and made me physically very tired, since I still had to work in the carpenter's shop as well. We could not afford tractors, so we still had to resort to older tools. So, it happened that one day I was driving one of the hand plows through the dirty ground and was lost in my thoughts and full of sweat. I was quite far away from the village, as the nearby surroundings had been worked shortly after the beginning of the thaw. The fields were extensive, partly reaching further than the eye could see. Only in one direction the dense forest extended, which introduced the beginning of a dark hilly landscape. That finally merged northward into high, alien mountains, whose white peaks rose high into the sky and, like once the Tower of Babel, blasphemously tried to penetrate the heavens. But next to these distant giants there was only the plain, the vast plain that had to be tilled. I hated the field work. And I hated the fields. Every time I even thought about this piece of hell that had become reality long ago, my stomach turned. All the events that clung to this dark place. All the human lives and suffering that had sown the ground with death and blood here many years ago. It was even worse when you stood in the fields yourself, truly being there on your own. It was as if I could smell it in the air, the rot of the starving and the hot blood that had watered the soil. It was as if I could still hear in the air the cries and wailing of the people who had met their end here, who had pleaded for their lives and the lives of their children and friends. It was as if I could see them in the early morning fog banks that lay on the fields of death, the shadows of people past, crawling and cowering, weak and starved. I had to pull myself together and look away, into the forest. A place does not forget, a place always remembers the days gone by and the cries that had been. The plow pulled through the ground, ripping a furrow behind it. It was almost a bit comforting to imagine I was gutting this place of horror with my labor, inflicting deep wounds. Hypnotized, I stared down over and over again, watching the ground swirl to one side, smelling the fresh earth being pushed to the surface. But never could I escape my terrible feelings and the forebodings, never could I forget what kind of place I was at. The few times I looked to the forest beside me, my thoughts wandered enviously to all those who had set out to find the angel. Had they reached it yet? Had they already learned from it what needed to be done for God's power on earth to be strengthened so that false prophets and promises could be swept away? How to drown the selfishness of the state? What needed to be done to serve the Lord? Oh, how I would have loved to be there, how I would have loved to go with them, but I also understood the decision not to send everyone, and I understood my family's objections. I was needed here. I could serve the Lord here by tilling the fields and taking care of the soil and the sowing. I had to care for my sister. I had already made several furrows when noon came. The sun was almost not visible, just a murky spot behind the clouds, and the fog had not lifted either. The world looked pale and apathetic. But amongst all the desolation I could suddenly hear something that seemed to come out of the forest. It was at first just like a rustling in the wind that sounded a bit too regular, such that it triggered a natural uneasiness in me. I looked into the forest, but could hardly make out anything through the dense plants and the still lingering fog. That is why it was left to my own thoughts to imagine what was there, what was producing this strange noise. I could not remember any animal that made similar sounds, was at a loss. Suddenly, a bang echoed through the forest, accompanied by a panicked scream that broke inhumanly from the trees and spread across the fields. Then, something new joined the sounds in the air. The trees and bushes rustled, almost seemed to be torn apart. Something was running through the forest, something seemed to be coming right at me. Was it perhaps a startled bear, an elk, or a wild boar? Had one of the hunters from the village accidentally startled an animal, scared it in the wrong direction and now wanted to warn us with their cry? But then, why this panicked sound? I paused, took my hands off the rusty handles of the plow, and turned toward the forest. Still, I could only see fog, I could only hear rustling. But slowly I could also make out grunts and groans coming to me from the fog. It sounded heavy and panic-stricken. Was I in danger? I began to pray to the Lord and ask Him for assistance. I was not a fighter, and so I had to hope that nothing would reach me from the depths between the trees that could easily tear me apart. Even the darkness will not be dark to you, the night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. My baptismal motto gave me courage. The Lord saw me, even in my darkness, and would be with me. For darkness is as light to you. Then, someone burst out of the bushes and the fog and rushed toward me. It was Sasha. I almost didn't recognize him. His skin was pale, almost snow-white. His black hair stuck to his sweaty face. His pants and jacket were almost completely torn, so I could see his dirty shirt and his cut and bruised legs through the holes. There were also some small cuts on his face that worried me. Sasha's eyes twitched searchingly, panicked, and in his hand, he held the rifle that he had taken with him when he had once set out. Apparently, he had run through brush and thorns, had gotten scrapes and wounds from stones and branches. When he saw me and looked at me with his big, panic-filled eyes, I became horridly afraid. It was as if, behind his eyes, there was no Sasha anymore, but only an animal. As if instinct had taken over his thoughts when an unnameable terror had entered his world. An animal inside him, which had enabled him to escape from something. Sasha staggered out of the forest. It was almost as if all strength left him now that he was back home. The rifle fell from his hand and dug into the mud beneath his feet. He limped slowly toward me, not taking his eyes off me. Then, suddenly, he wheeled around and looked back into the forest and the mist. Only for a moment. Again, he let out a shrill scream and sprinted the last few meters. When I looked into the forest myself, I saw nothing, only the fog. But didn't I feel a presence there, in the bushes? Between the trees? I didn't see anything. Sasha had reached me and collapsed. I quickly knelt down next to him and called for help, but the other field workers had already rushed over, obviously attracted by the rifle shot. I was in a trance, seeing only Sasha lying there, supporting his head. His eyes were still twitching around, and despite my proximity he didn't seem to recognize me. He looked at me, confused. "Sasha, what happened?" I asked, feeling his forehead. Despite his paleness, he was uncomfortably hot. A fever raged in his body. Who knew how long he had been running around there among the trees, his protective, warming jacket torn, with wounds that had not been tended and some of which were still bleeding. Then another horrible thought occurred to me. "Sasha, where are the others? Sasha, where are the others?" This question apparently brought back some clarity that his gaze had not possessed before. They took them. Took all of them, all of them. All our brothers, all our sisters, all of them, her gurgled. So, this is the first part of what I found. I will hurry to translate the rest. But I will definitely stay out of the woods for now. They are still as creepy as described by Ilya in this document, and fog is still around every morning. Also, I don't know what to make of Ilya himself as well. Is he just a religious nut and that is the explanation? I just don't know.
That is the first part of this story. What are the legends that lurks behind the fields of death? What did Zarina really saw? Was it really an angel, or a spawn of horror? What happened to the team of Sasha? What does he mean by them? Who are they? To know what happened on the next part, share and subscribe to the Double Dutchman, and turn on the notification bell to receive all the updates from us. And also, I kindly ask you to like and share this video, and comment down below on what kind of content you want to see next. We'll see you on the next part of this story.